じゃあきっと幸せになれるわ。
火星へ逃げるつもりか？逃げ回ってもどこまで行けるかな。
誰の？
時代遅れのカーボーイさ。
賞金稼ぎの？
ご名答。
捕まえないの？
あんたの連れは体をかなりやられてる。弱ってる雑魚を相手にしないんだ。
それが利口だわ。
Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is the third video in a series of 4 that we're basing on extracts from the first episode of Cowboy Bebop. So let's get stuck in.
じゃあきっと幸せになれるわ。
火星へ逃げるつもりか？
じゃあきっと幸せになれるわ。
火星へ逃げるつもりか？
The bit that I want to focus on here is the particle e. I started learning Japanese in 1995, and even then I was told right at the outset, even if only by a textbook, that the particle e was slowly disappearing from the Japanese language. Don't get me wrong, it's still there, but I, to all intents and purposes, never use it. The natives will tell you that there are certain nuances, certain shades of meaning that it expresses, but they are very subtle and very difficult to really comprehend properly, and that's why I just use ni on the whole. There are certain standard explanations of the difference between ni and e when you're talking about movement, motion in a certain direction. You'll be told that ni focuses the attention on the destination and to some extent implies that you're actually going to get there, whereas e focuses people's attention on the path taken, the journey taken, and doesn't imply as strongly that you're necessarily going to get to the place in question. Does that mean that ni is a bit like to and that e is a bit like towards? Maybe there's a hint of that there, but I would be careful with that. There's obviously a lot of overlap in where you can use ni and where you can use e in Japanese, but there isn't much overlap between to and towards in English. If I say, I have to go to London tomorrow, that means one thing. But if I said, I have to go towards London tomorrow, that's strange. It's a bit difficult to think of a context, a natural context, in which you'd actually want to say that. The difference in the Japanese is much more subtle than that. If I wanted to say towards in Japanese without using the particle e, how would I say it? Well, good question. Without any particular context, it's difficult to say, but I would probably say something like Rondon no hou ni iku. If I wanted to say I'm heading towards London right now, I'd probably say Ima Rondon ni mukatteru, or perhaps Ima Rondon no hou ni mukatteru. I don't really use e in Japanese at all. Is that some sort of weakness in my Japanese? Well, insofar as the natives still do use it to some extent, yeah, I suppose it is, but I don't think it's a particularly serious problem. The only big difference between ni and e is that you can put the particle no after e, but not after ni in Japanese. If I want to say a letter to a friend, I can say tomodachi e no tegami, but I can't say tomodachi ni no tegami. You can never put no after ni in Japanese, ever. Not only in this context, ever. So if I ever end up using e when I speak Japanese, it's probably in that sort of context.
逃げ回ってもどこまで行けるかな。
誰の？
時代遅れのカーボーイさ。逃げ回ってもどこまで行けるかな。
誰の？
時代遅れのカーボーイさ。
Just another example here of gendered language. And I'm not talking about this because I'm obsessed with gender. I'm talking about it because it's interesting in the context of Japanese, right? We mentioned earlier that if you drop the da, the copula at the end of a sentence, that can, well, it will end up sounding on the whole rather feminine. Here you'll notice that Spike drops the da, but he replaces it with sa. I seem to recall that Spike uses this sa quite a lot, this sentence ending sa. It's quite characteristic of a very relaxed, informal, masculine way of speaking. I don't feel that it's actually particularly common in real everyday Japanese in Japan, and I myself never really felt comfortable using it. Remember, anime characters often have very stylized ways of speaking that are not necessarily particularly realistic. Sa can replace da, it can go immediately after a verb or a sentence ending form if you like, and it can also go after a no. So you get iku sa and iku no sa. I strongly suggest you avoid trying to use it. One day when your Japanese is much better than it is now, when it's much better than mine perhaps, then you can use it as much as you like. But for the time being, it's going to sound weird and contrived if you keep shoving it on the end of your sentences. There are two other similar particles, if they are indeed particles, that you can use in Japanese. They're quite interesting. Both of them introduce pauses into what you say and give you time to think. So if you take the simple question, これはどうする? You can say, これさ、どうする? So this relatively long これさ, this sa, is almost replacing the topic marker. It's almost acting as an informal topic marker, but you have to drag it out and pause. I can say, これはどうする? But I cannot say, これさどうする? That sounds utterly bizarre. If you want to use it, you have to say, これさどうする? So because it's quite long, you could probably legitimately write it as sa, a, ai as a long vowel. And then there's another sa that comes after kedo. そうなんだけどさ、そうなんだけどさ、どうすればいいのかわかんないよ. That one also requires a lengthening of the vowel and a sort of pause. そうなんだけどさ, ... as you think of what you want to say next. So basically you have something that provides the speaker with room to think and also somehow acts as an informal topic marker that replaces wa. And if that didn't make any sense to you, well, it doesn't make that much sense to me, and I've never read anything about that use of sa anywhere, but that is indeed what it seems to do.
賞金稼ぎ
ご名答。
捕まえないの？
あんたの連れは体をかなりやられてる。
賞金稼ぎ
ご名答。
捕まえないの？
あんたの連れは体をかなりやられてる。
This is a good example of the so-called suffering passive. Your friend, his body has been quite done. Means that he's in a bad way physically. He looks kind of knackered and beaten up. He looks like he's not doing very well. This verb yaru, to do, actually means lots of different things in Japanese. So you have to do, it can mean to kill. Obviously it can mean to damage or to hurt or to beat. I think it also has a sexual meaning, as you might expect if it means to do. Notice that the particle used here in this suffering passive is the particle o. That's important. Otherwise it's not the suffering passive, so-called. I know that the suffering passive doesn't always imply suffering, but it often does, and the name has stuck, so we'll go with it. It's important to notice that the te-iru form, the i has gone missing because this is informal, but the te-iru form being used here isn't the present progressive. It doesn't mean something is happening right now. It means that something has already happened and that the effects of that, whatever it was, still exist. I can't try and explain this here. I don't think I've actually come up with a good explanation as to how this works. But bear in mind that if you hear this in Japanese, その箱に何が入ってる? It means what's in that box, what has gone into that box and remained there. It doesn't mean what's entering that box. So this use of the te-iru form to describe something that's already happened is very common in Japanese.
弱ってる雑魚を相手にしないんだ。
それが利口だわ。
弱ってる雑魚を相手にしないんだ。
それが利口だわ。
Lastly here we have a very good example as to why you should never try and translate Japanese literally directly into English. A reasonably direct translation would be something like, I don't make opponents out of weakened miscellaneous fish. Spike has the reputation of being fairly cool. I think you'll agree that if he spoke English like that, no one would think that he was cool. Zako means small fry, basically, just tiny little fish that get, I don't know, caught up as part of a bigger catch. So it means people who are beneath you, people who aren't worth bothering with. It's often used in anime and manga when people are belittling their enemies. The verb yowaru means to become feeble or to get all run down, to end up in bad physical condition. So Spike is saying in effect, I don't pick on small fry like him, people who are already all beaten up. Which doesn't sound tremendously cool, but sounds certainly a bit cooler than the previous option, with what, miscellaneous fish or what? Notice that the pronunciation of zako here is actually zako. Back in the good old days when I was learning Japanese at university, I was well aware of the fact that these syllables in Japanese were sometimes pronounced with an affricate instead of a fricative, which is to say as za instead of za. Z is the voiced equivalent of ts, and you know that Japanese has the syllable tsu. So it's not that surprising that the voiced equivalent of that exists at least somewhere in the language. You don't really need to produce it yourself when you speak Japanese, although if you can figure out where exactly to do it, I'm sure it'll make you sound a little bit more authentic. Dorgan discusses it here and there, I'm sure, in his pronunciation course, so if you want more information, then you can go and listen to what he has to say. As far as I'm aware, I never pronounced any of these syllables like this, with this affricate z instead of z. It wasn't really stressed when I was learning Japanese, and after speaking Japanese for a long time, I'd have to have a pretty good reason to try and change the way I pronounce it, and to be honest, I don't. But if you want a little bit more authenticity, then you could work some of that into the way you speak Japanese. My understanding is that you can never be considered to be pronouncing things wrong if you avoid the affricate z and use the fricative z instead. So we're pretty much done for today. Thanks for dropping by, I appreciate it. I'll see you all next time. Thank you, ciao ciao, bye bye.